Welcome to the Minority Report. I'm your host, Birshel Titi, and you're tuned into the program where we're talking about issues, accomplishments, and the lives of minorities. And this week on our fourth season, we're talking 2012 elections, youth, and minorities. With only 7 days left until the election, all eyes are here on Washington, D.C., and the fight for the White House as both candidates make their last efforts for a vote. Their campaigns have focused on uncommitted and undecided voters who make up nearly 10% of the voting electorate. And while President Obama and Governor Romney fight for these votes, some wonder if they've given up on the youth and minority vote. Here this week to tell us why both these voters matter are panelists who say that their voice and vote count in the race to the White House. So we are here 7 days into the election, so we're a little bit heated. And before we get started, I do want to put in, the byline here that we did invite the college Republicans to come attend as well. Unfortunately, they weren't able to make it. So I don't know between the 7 days if we'll be able to get them at the table, but we're going to keep on the conversation either way. So I'm going to introduce our panel quite quickly. John Rohrer, who is president of the College Democrats, Brittany Brin, who is president of the Caribbean Students Union, and Danielle Melfi, who is president of the Student Government Association here at Loyola. So thank you all for joining us today to have such a heated topic and in the midst of a heated moment right now, a heated week. So what I really want to talk about before we even get into the minority aspect and the vote is the youth vote, because we're all at that critical age between 18 and 30 where we're considered a great vote to have, but one that never comes out. So just to go back to 2008, just over half of youth voted, ranging from 18 to 30, and that was 1 in 4 votes according to USA Today. And that's kind of alarming, because most people are assuming from 18 on to 30 you're educated on the political system, you want to be active. It's that time where you're kind of a rebel and you're in between different things, and at the same time you're starting a profession, you're starting a family, so there's a lot going on in that age range. So why do you think that young voters aren't coming out to the polls?
I think that youth voters particularly are very disillusioned with the system. They think that we're a two-party system here and that their vote doesn't matter either way. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think as students, especially on a college campus, that we really need to work on our ends to address.
Yeah, I don't think they're educated enough about what's going on, so they're like, should I vote, should I not vote, does my vote even count? So I think that's why we don't see a lot of students or a lot of young people coming out to vote.
I think in 2008 with Obama, which the young youth vote voted for overwhelmingly, Obama was new at that point. He was, just right out of Illinois. He had just been a state senator 4 years before that, and then was only a senator for a couple years. Mm-hmm. And so he was something new to the political stage. And this time around, 4 years later, they've seen him for 4 years, and it's not that jubilant guy full of energy that we all voted for in 2008.
Yeah, and I think that's the case for not even just young voters, but voters in general, because even in the slogans you see the difference between hope and change and forward. Yeah. Right. And at the same time, though they're both optimistic, it's very different. But something that both of you guys are talking about is the lack of education that students or the youth vote may have, and why they don't then go out and vote. So how then do you educate people so that they know the system? Because the way we're taught, people believe that in grade school and in high school, in your government classes and your history classes, that you're learning the political system and you should understand the importance of actually voting. So how do you change that then? Because if it's supposed to be taught in classrooms and the curriculum is there, but we're all sitting here saying that the education isn't, what's the divide there? What's the, disconnect?
I think a lot of the disconnect lies in the issues themselves, where students our age don't realize that as we're voting, if you're 18 and voting for a president that will be in there for 4 years, those policies will shape your life for the next 4 years and for your future. And I think students and youth voters really feel a disconnect between how those issues really affect them personally and the long-term implications of the variety of issues every election season.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it comes from the home too, because if you're not told at home that this is important, like you need to pay attention so that years down the line you can go out, vote, let your voice be heard, then make a change. But I think it starts from the home as well, because when I ask a lot of my peers, I'm like, oh, so are you gonna vote? They're like, nah, my mom doesn't vote, my dad isn't really into politics, so I'm not really gonna vote. So I think it also starts from the home as well as school.
Right, but the thing with that is a lot of times we're saying that it should start at the home, but then parents are thinking, I'm sending my child to school for this. And it's not just in the case of voting, that's just in general. When you talk about sex education or nutrition and health, whatever the case may be, a lot of times school is the place that people in general or adults rely on getting that education for their kids. So then how's the question answered then if it's not starting at the home? if it's a problem in the school systems?
Well, the Loyal Democrats last year and this year have tried to focus on issues that are important to youth vote. And those include LGBT rights, women's rights, that kind of thing, equal pay. So we're trying to educate, college students on things that affect them every day. For many who went to maybe a private school, a religious private school, this might be the first time that they, are friends with a gay person, and so they are learning new things and having new experiences, and their worldview is changing dramatically. And so we're trying to focus on those issues and educate people on that. And we believe that the choice is very clear on many of these social issues, and so it gives the students also an easier decision to make on who they believe has their viewpoint.
So aside from organizations, then I guess a question could be, should we hold the candidates responsible for educating us on their platforms and the issues and why it's even important to vote? Because like you were saying earlier, sometimes it's just apathy, like, who am I voting for? What's the point? It's a two-party system, as Danielle, you were saying earlier, and what does my vote actually count for? So how do candidates educate, or is that even their responsibility to educate about this system?
I think it's the responsibility of candidates to educate about the system, but also make clear in any of their presentations that what the issues actually are, because I think that's a lot of the problem with the debates, even for example, where candidates stick to kind of their party platforms and the main things that their constituents want them to get across without really appealing to the broader base, especially regarding undecided voters. And I think educating people on the issues more clearly, rather than us having to go to fact checkers and reading kind of all the briefings the next day to actually know what's going on.
Right.
Yeah, I think that the candidates should definitely take responsibility and visit the schools. Like I know about 2 weeks ago, Michelle Obama came to Morgan State and she made an address there. So,
but then what schools are you visiting? Because let's be honest, the schools that are being visited aren't schools, they won't be schools that aren't in swing states. They won't be schools where the youth vote doesn't typically come out, so.
Yeah, that is true. I think they should make an effort into kind of not just targeting towards like black schools, but state schools and even private schools like Loyola, but we'll see.
I'd say that, an important thing that the candidates need to do is, I think it's also the responsibility of the press, and I think that there needs to be more questioning from journalists about what people's specific positions are. As we saw in the vice presidential debate, the moderator was very good at asking both candidates what their specific positions were on these issues. And so for college students, and I think most undecided voters, they hate the generality. They hate to have people say, well, I'm for less government, but I'm not going to tell you how I'm going to initiate that. So there needs to be more responsibility on the media to try to have a fact-by-fact look at both candidates.
And I think that's how a lot of people feel in general with all situations in terms of media coverage. And since we look to the media to address these issues or do presidential debates and be the ones to target the questions, that's who we're looking to actually help define what's going on if candidates aren't. So actually, we're going to cut really quickly to one media source. So this is to answer for you, John, to your question. USA Today, I believe, put a really quick video together of who will actually be voting in these presidents and kind of to see the numbers of where you fall and if, in some sense, that your vote is important. So we're going to watch that video quite quickly, and we'll be right back. So we are back. I told you it was really quick. And although it doesn't focus exactly on the youth vote, it does kind of get to the history and the teaching part of what our conversation is and kind of breaking down the electoral votes and how you're actually voting in and what your state really counts for. And it's talking about 150 swing states and 12 states that can actually swing the votes. So just seeing that, is that something that we could use to educate ourselves? Is that something that as youth we need to know?
I think it's kind of has its positive and negatives in that if your state is not a swing state, then how does that, if your state has constantly been red or constantly been blue historically, then why should you be empowered to vote if there's the perception that your vote doesn't matter?
Yeah, I agree. Like, Georgia, we know, is definitely Republican. Like, no matter what, they're going to always be majority Republican. So if I live in Georgia, I'm going to be like, well, my vote doesn't matter. So.
Yeah, and I think that a positive is, though, we see in swing states a lot of youth engagement. You know, people will change their residency to the state in which they're going to college.
Ohio, definitely. Ohio
Right.
University
Yeah,
has
it's
been
huge.
one hit by the campaign hard
Yeah.
and on college campuses, and a lot of students tend to do that.
Yeah, so that's just a good example of something positive it can bring. But I think that, you know, it does also for those students who have a problem with the system. I know a lot of people on this campus who have a problem with how we elect our president or the process and, you know, campaign finance. The Electoral College is something that should be looked at, you know, that should be talked about. Is there something that we could probably do as a country to make it a little more fair and put less of a burden on a few states for the president, I mean, for the candidates themselves? So.
But that's a hard question to then pose to citizens if we can't even get them to the polls, and that's kind of one of the main issues in politics or government in general, is that people aren't turning out. And a lot of different organizations have made their efforts in some sense, and one of which is Rock the Vote. And Danielle, you've been working with them here on campus to kind of make the movement for youth in particular to get their vote out. So how does that work in some sense? How is an organization like Rock the Vote pioneering, in one sense, getting the vote out, but then starting the process of, let me be political, let me actually learn about the system, let me see if there's something wrong, how I could change it?
I think Rock the Vote, how we've started at Loyola is through the Student Government Association, getting a campaign together to actually help students register to vote and then apply for their absentee ballots. Because I think it's also the more steps there are, the more difficult it makes for youth to vote, and then students will have that as an excuse. I'm not voting because I didn't have an envelope, I didn't have a stamp, I'm not meeting the deadlines. So making it easy for students, it gets rid of the excuses. You don't have an excuse, so we're getting people out there, making it a present issue to discuss. So walking around campus now, people are getting their ballots in the mail. Now you hear them talk about it, which is awesome, and it's really kind of facilitated this campus community full of political discourse where most of the time I feel we don't see that here.
Aside from the institution itself and bodies like yourself, we have two organizations here, and you guys have been active in terms of the political process and the elections. How are student organizations and youths themselves responsible to get this initiative going, to actually push other peers and remind them how important it is to vote? How do you do that, and do you find yourselves responsible for that?
Well, I think that there are a lot of organizations on campus that you know, are made up of minority groups on campus that do have a lot of stake in this election. I know Spectrum, for example, has worked with me to try to figure something out where we can have, you know, a discussion about where LGBT rights are part of the national conversation. And then, you know, a couple weeks ago, I was part of a panel with Alana to go over you know, some of the issues facing minority voters. So I think that these great organizations on campus that bring certain groups together really you know, start up a really good conversation. So I think that's important for these organizations.
Yeah, I think it's very important. My organization, the Caribbean Students Union, we're pairing up with the Asian Cultural Alliance, and we're having a panel discussion called Let's Talk Politics. And I think it's very important to get students to register to vote and everything, but they also need to know the issues that are at hand. And because we are a minority group, we're going to be discussing minority issues such as LGBTQ rights and women's rights and affirmative action and all those different issues. So I think it's very important that we're going to let the kids know what these issues are, and to also allow their voice to be heard and question the panelists on their opinions on the different issues.
And I think aside from even the issues too, another responsibility that some people believe that these organizations or government and politicians should have is actually teaching the history. And that's kind of something that's really difficult to I mean, our country is only, 200 years or so old, and it's still difficult to teach our history to students. But Rock the Vote actually put out a video to kind of do a 3-minute, here's what the history of our nation is. And even then you see like they struggle with it and have to input celebrities for it to seem interesting, or have to do a lot of graphics and animations. And it is great. So what we're going to do is watch it really quickly, and we're going to kind of shift gears and talk a little bit about the minority vote and some of the things that are said in the video. So we're going to watch that, and we'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Perez Hilton. Did you know that more people in the United States check their Facebook and watch the Super Bowl, then exercise their right to vote? We've got some serious issues to deal with. So how come so many of us don't even bother to vote? Is it because we don't care? Or maybe it's because we don't know our history.
So let's go back, way back. Our country's first election came after fighting for our independence, a fight that cost many lives, but it was worth it because instead of being ruled by a king, we were finally able to make our own laws.
But not everybody was allowed to participate. You see, back then, you had to own property, be white, and a man in order to actually vote. Now, things continued that way for about 80 years, until after the Civil War, when slavery was abolished and all men were given the right to vote.
Now hold up a minute. Just because we had the right to vote didn't mean we could use it. See, all these new voters wanted to participate, which threatened the people in power and their ability to stay in power. So they tried to stop us with violence and shady new requirements like literacy tests and poll taxes. We had to fight for nearly 100 years before the Voting Rights Act passed, which finally outlawed these dirty tricks.
And you weren't the only ones that had to fight for your right to vote. Somehow women got left out and had to organize and fight state by state. Until we took our fight to Washington and finally got our right to vote all across the country. And even once the laws guaranteed every person the ability to vote, you still had to be 21 in most states. So when our government began drafting people under 21 to go fight in Vietnam, they realized their lives were at stake and they had no say. Young people all across the country rose up in protest and demanded that everyone over 18 should be allowed to vote.
And since then, young people's votes have been crucial in deciding lots of big elections. Like in 2008, when a black candidate had a real chance to become president, young people showed up in record numbers. And every year, we make up a larger share of the voting population, giving young people more power, but only if we participate.
So let me break it down. Together, there is so much we can decide, like whether or not we should go to war, or how we spend our money, and how we power our lives.
We can determine who has the right to marry, and who has the right to choose, what possessions should be outlawed, and whether or not we should legalize.
It's up to you to make your choices and shape our future. If we sit on the sidelines, then others will make it work for them instead of us. So let's make our voices heard.
So what would it take for you to vote?